Well, thanks everyone for being here. I am Priya Joshi, and I am the co-founder for foodwize. And this is what we call our Be Foodwise webinar series. We've done a number of these over the last 12 to 18 months. And we actually started this series as part of our broader work towards towards equipping, educating all people, but I'll kind of say particularly urban people about food and particularly about the influence on food in a multidimensional way. The purpose of this webinar series for us has always been to have, the broadest possible conversation that we can have about food. Because when you really think about it, the fundamental relationship for food is with the land, with the ocean, with the communities that produce food, and that relationship then in turn has a direct impact, of course, on our health, which by itself is a matter of great discussion and discourse at this point of time in urban places. And um, and so today, to talk to us about ecological democracy and food sovereignty, we're really delighted to have Ashish Kothari. Ashish is a pioneering environmentalist and author. And in his own words, he's the founder of Kalpavriksha. And in his own words, he actually does not know how to describe himself. Ashish, I saw you said that about yourself. He describes himself as an Indian environmentalist who is working on development, but in a number of different ways, on environment interface, on biodiversity policy and alternatives. And so as we, try to imagine what a sustainable future means, it's important that we imagine it also from the perspective of resilient food systems, which are absolutely at the heart in many different ways, at the heart of a sustainable future. So thank you, Ashish, for being here and for making the time. We know how frightfully busy you are. We are recording the first part of this session. Ashish is going to present for the first 45 to 50 minutes using some material. So we are recording that just so that we can make it available again on Foodwise's YouTube channel and a couple of other places. And then we will still have, about 35, 40 minutes for open conversation, questions and answers. So once Ashish finishes his talk, we'll stop the recording. So please be very open in your conversation at all points of time during this session. I will turn over to you, Ashish, and I think you're all set up to share your slides as well.
Thank you, Priya. Thanks, Chaitali, Sujata, and everybody else at Foodwise for this opportunity. Would be great to do this physically, person to person, but this is, I guess, the next best option. Yeah, so I think in the interest of giving maximum time for the discussion, let me jump straight into the presentation. It's going to be a bit longish. It's about 45 minutes or so. Try and make it maximum 45 minutes so that we have enough time for discussion. Let me see if this works. Yeah, just tell me, you can see the slides?
Yeah, all
okay.
good. Yeah.
Yes. All right. Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think sometimes when I speak about food and democracy, people are a little confused as to what's the relationship. So that's precisely what I want to try and tease out in this presentation, because food, if anything, is actually very intimately connected to society and how it's organized, how it's governed, who's taking decisions, for whom, at whose cost, for whose benefit, etc. So that's what I wanted to sort of deal with. Basically, I'll do this in 4 parts. The first is just looking at India's own food and agricultural heritage and what has happened to it in the last few decades in particular. I'll do that very quickly. The second then is looking at initiatives from communities, rural and urban, towards food security and food sovereignty. And food sovereignty obviously is a term that needs explanation, which I'll come to. The third is to then say, okay, out of these grounded initiatives all over India and a few from other parts of the world, what are the kind of broad frameworks of transformation and change that are emerging, which could be an alternative to the currently dominant systems of not just agriculture, but democracy, governance, etc. And the fourth is what are we trying to do for future in terms of networking, and what more can people such as participants on this call do? So I think it's very important. All of you know this. So this is just a kind of a refresher, let's say. Either in a country like India or across the global south, all the southern countries, the dependence of communities on land or nature and natural resources and different kinds of ecosystems is very, very direct and very inextricable. So even now, despite all the so-called development and industrialization and urbanization, perhaps something like 65% of the population in the Indian subcontinent is dependent in this way for one or more of the products that you see on the screen. And food, of course, is one of them. And so when these natural ecosystems or land or waters are destroyed or disturbed in some way, then there is a direct impact on the survival, on the livelihood security, on food security, etc., of communities who are dependent on them. Now, this is a fact that should have been at the center of all of our development planning. Unfortunately, it has not been. The other very crucial part is that the Indian subcontinent is extremely fortunate in having a very, very, very diverse natural heritage, which has then been used in agriculture. There's, of course, many thousands of years of communities living in this landscape and seascape. And through that, and through their own intelligence and trial and error, sort of developing a huge diversity of ways of life, of crops, of livestock, of cultures associated to the land and to food and agriculture. And if you look at just the sheer amount of biodiversity, this is when I come to this slide, one of my favorite questions to people, especially if the young people in the room, is how many varieties of mango has anybody here eaten? And you get to maybe maximum 7 or 8 that somebody, or maybe 10 if there's a child whose parents have been moving around the country. But and so then I say, okay, how many varieties do you think there are? And normally you said people say 50, 60, 70. Of course, there'll be very adventurous kids who might say 10,000. But so then we come to actually figures of agricultural biodiversity to the extent that they're known. We know that mango itself is more than 1,000 varieties. The most astounding, of course, is rice, possibly up to 300,000 varieties. And the other very nice exercise we do then is, okay, how many varieties can the classroom name? Yeah, and maybe we'll get to about 10, 12 varieties. So then sort of understanding why this diversity, because it's not only from nature. When you have 50,000 varieties of rice, this is what human beings, communities have actually evolved out of one species, which they would have found undomesticated long, long, long back, right? So then why do they diversify? What is the reasons? What are the uses of rice? From, of course, food and nutrition to medicine to cultural reasons. There are some rice varieties that are used only in ceremonies like death and marriage ceremonies. There are some that are used for medicinal. If somebody is sick, then for that, etc. So the reason why people also grew a diversity of crops was to meet different human needs and aspirations, but also as a resilience, as a factor of resilience. Because if there was a drought, there would still be some rice varieties or other crops that would grow. If there was floods, there would still be some other crops that grow. And that was the reason for diversity of both crops and and livestock, animal breeds. Even dogs. We have a tendency to basically in our houses have dogs which are exotic, but India itself has more than 35 indigenous breeds, right? Most of them, unfortunately, badly neglected. Now, having kind of ignored this diversity, natural diversity, agricultural diversity, and the cultural heritage and the importance of it for the last thousands of years, 1960s onwards, we saw a very major shift in agriculture, this with the incoming of the Green Revolution and then subsequently the White and Blue Revolutions, milk and oceans, where, of course, productivity increased significantly, and that, of course, was one of the objectives. But in the process, because this productivity was increasing significantly based on looking at agriculture as a single as grains only, or only the milk production, etc., and ignoring all the rest of what that agricultural ecosystem was doing, and then, of course, pumping in chemicals, hybrid seeds, etc. What we've seen across the country is a serious, very, very serious ecological deterioration of the soil, of water, the erosion of diversity. From those 50,000 varieties of rice, possibly less than 1,000 are now grown actively. And small farmers getting pushed more and more into indebtedness, because earlier, when they were able to actually depend on their own inputs or on shared inputs and exchanges within the community, now there's a lot of dependence on the market, which means money. Money is, borrowed from mostly, actually, not from banks, but from local money lenders, who can be extremely exploitative. And that's why we see this phenomenon of farmer suicides. In fact, that figure is slightly old. It's almost 500,000 now. And this is then encompassed within the larger framework. The Green Revolution is one manifestation of the larger framework of development, which has been adopted wholesale from the West, and essentially means that we must have economic growth at any rate. So industrialization, urbanization, grabbing of lands for all of these purposes, and considering agriculture, fisheries, forestries as being low status occupations, from where people have to be moved out and moved into industry or IT or services or whatever, right? So that's that whole, this is the sort of context in which we are considering and looking at something like food. And so-called development projects like big dams and mining alone have displaced about 60 million people. 6 crore people. That's more than the population of most countries of the world. And this is about physical uprooting. And then many, many tens of millions more whose lands have been taken away, or water has been taken away, or water has been poisoned, etc. So that's one side of the picture. There is, of course, the other side, which is that development has also given us benefits, especially, I guess, people like us who are on this call, who can even afford to be on a laptop or a computer and be on this call. And who possibly, I'm sure everybody on this call has a smartphone, except me, and so on. So if you look at normal indicators of development, India seems to be doing reasonably well. But it is at the cost of something else. And that includes some of what I already spoke about, but it also includes nature in general. This is an advertisement from about 35 years back, actually. Dotsal is an Indian multinational corporation. And essentially what the ad says is that if nature is a barrier between you and development, in this case, pipelines, then it has to be uprooted. That's the explicit language in the ad. Okay, now, maybe ad agencies will not produce an ad like this anymore because they know it's politically inappropriate. But the model of development is still exactly the same. If a forest is in the way, or Adivasi community is in the way, or a fishing community is in the way of so-called development, move them aside, right? So in that sense, development has come as violence in many different forms to sections of society and to the rest of nature. This also intersects with the the very ugly phenomenon of inequality in India and elsewhere in the world, where today, for instance, the top 5 to 10% of India has something like 95% of its wealth, right? Its earnings, and about 50% of its wealth. So if you were to kind of look at the fact that there is significantly more money and revenues in the economy because of high rates of growth, that sounds good, except for the fact that much of that is cornered by a small section of India's population, which gets richer and richer and richer, and is able to build a 27-story house for a 5-member family, which I'm sure all of you know whose house that is. In the same city where 40 to 50% of the population don't have adequate housing, and of course, adequate nutritious food and so on. We're also seeing, and these are figures that are not very well advertised by the government, but independent agencies are bringing them out, that despite all the increases in food production in Green Revolution, malnutrition is actually increasing in India. And a certain section of poor people are actually even getting less food than they were earlier because of the marketization, the destruction of lands, etc. So it's not a pretty picture if you start looking at these sorts of nuances. And the people who are, of course, the poorest are hit the worst because they can't afford, they may no longer be able to grow their food, even if they could earlier. They can hardly afford to buy too much food, especially nutritious food like pulses and meat and so on, which they might need for protein. Um, and they fall sick. When they fall sick, they don't have access to affordable healthcare because that also is something the government is squeezing. More and more healthcare is becoming privatized. So I mean, again, studies have shown how much more of the percentage of a household income is now spent on health than it was maybe even 30 years back. COVID, of course, was a period in which we learned that all of these things were extremely important because the vulnerability of such people to a health crisis like this or to the economic crisis that COVID brought on was much greater than for people like us who had fallback options. Finally, I think in terms of the bad news, we are now also facing fairly severe impacts of the climate crisis. This is no longer coming, it's already here. And everywhere I go, I mean, recently I was in Kashmir, for instance, farmers, fishing communities, they're all talking about how productivity is going down, erratic rainfall or snowfall patterns. Um, I was at the Ular lake, which is a lake of national significance, and the fishing communities they were saying how much the fish production is actually itself dropped for many reasons, but that also includes climate. But also, on the other hand, unfortunately, we don't, as a country, yet have any kind of a national um, adaptation plan. How do communities who are now suffering the consequences, including with food or water or other things, how do they cope? Is something we have given very little attention to. So I'm going to stop with the bad news there. Don't want people to lose their appetites. So, and anyway, this is the sort of thing that most of you would be familiar with. I want to focus much more now looking at alternatives because this question is, yeah, okay, all of this is happening, but we have to go down this path if we want development, right? And so the question arises: is this really development? And if not, then are there alternatives, right? So for us, having been working on this for the last 45, 50 years, it seems to me that alternatives are of broadly two kinds. One is where people are saying no. So this is a image from the late 1980s of 300 Adivasi villages in central India on the Indravati River protesting against two very big dams, hydroelectricity projects that were proposed to be built on this river. And their protest was partly, of course, that they did not want these 300 villages to be displaced and all their land to be submerged and their forests to be submerged. But also that while the government thought of the river as a commodity from where you produce power, for them, the river was their mother. Now, this is a very interesting shift in narrative where you actually begin to understand that for a lot of communities, even now, how they relate to the rest of nature is very different from what the modern economy does. For the modern economy, nature is something to be exploited and made into economic growth. But for a lot of these communities, whether it's a river or it's the land or it's seeds, these are actually sacred. They are relatives of the human community, right? And in that sense, these protest movements, when they're saying no to something, they're also articulating their ways of sort of knowing and being and doing, and also fundamentally then challenging the structures of society which create these problems. Now, whether you think of that as domination by capitalist corporations or by the state or racism or patriarchy or different people have different poisons that they name, but basically, if you look at all of this, and then this notion which came in with a certain form of Western modernity that human beings are separate from nature and we're at the top of a pyramid, so we can basically rule nature and do anything we want with it. So certain anthropocentrism or human centrism. And so basically, if you look at these kinds of resistance movements, they are not just saying no to a particular project, but many of them are linking up and saying no to the structures that create this form of what is called development. In the field of food and agriculture, this includes protesting against land grabbing, against industrial scale fisheries, farming, animal husbandry, etc. For instance, India has had a long standing movement of traditional artisanal fishers against commercialized fishing, or against chemicals, genetically modified organisms, etc. And of course, when these movements happen, then the state hits back or corporates hit back. Recently, for instance, Kavita Kuruganti, one of the most well-known activists on organic and sustainable agriculture, was charged with defamation, with having defamed the Crop Care Federation of India, which sounds very nice. Crop care is, of course, lovely, right? But it's basically the pesticides lobby. And they accused her of being anti-development and anti-national and blah, blah, blah. And many of us then, as we protest against these things, get called all these different wonderful labels. So that's one kind of alternative. But along with that, we also need, of course, to have systems that produce basic needs and aspirations where there are tens of millions of people who don't yet have them. That could be food, it could be water, it could be energy, housing, education, health, whatever. And so in the last few years, we've been documenting or getting hold of case studies and stories of where people are meeting their needs and aspirations in ways that are very different from the dominant system, right? And of course, here in this today's session, I'm going to focus on food mostly, but also look at some of the others because they are all interrelated, as I said earlier. With food, this is an example many of you may be familiar with. It is my personal favorite in terms of inspiration that it's given me over the last 35 years, because it comes also from the most exploited, marginalized section of India's society is Dalit women, small scale farmers. This is in Telangana. And about 5,000 of them over the last 35 to 40 years, through a process of mobilization, collectivizing themselves in terms of sanghas or women's committees in about 60, 70 villages, bringing back all the traditional varieties of crops, especially millets, jowar, bajra, etc., and fighting for land rights for women, which is very unusual in India, collectivizing things like seeds, putting them back in the commons rather than privatizing them, creating grain banks in all the villages so that people have access to seeds for sowing, creating a parallel public distribution system, which is very interesting, and many, many other things. They've actually created, from a situation of hunger and malnutrition, they now have full food security in these 5,000 households. But they've also gone beyond that and fought for food sovereignty, or Anna Swaraj, which is to say complete control over everything to do with food production and consumption. That includes the seeds, the land, the water, and the knowledge, right? So I'm giving a 35-year-old history of a fantastic movement in 2 minutes. Obviously, I'm doing injustice to it, but this is the sort of thing that's actually emerging on the ground in terms of food. You go to the Northeast, in Nagaland and a couple of other states, the Northeast Network, which is a women's network, has been fighting to sustain its agricultural practices, both shifting cultivation and paddy cultivation, like you see here with terraced farming, and continue sort of intergenerational transmission, especially down from mothers to daughters or daughters-in-law, and also fight for rights over this kind of a landscape. So it's again, another very interesting movement for food security and food sovereignty. Over into Bangladesh, there is the Naya Krishi Andolan, which has, I think, something like 30,000 families involved or more, mostly small scale farming with very similar kind of objectives of reviving, retaining, sustaining their own forms of agriculture and their own control over those forms of agriculture and meeting needs of food and nutrition, etc. Sorry. Then back here in India, in the Western Ghats, Vanastri is another organization, again, mostly run by women, where they are trying to sustain or revive their home gardens, which have been such an important part of household food security across India, right? But have increasingly gone into disuse or been sold off for commercialization, etc. So how do you bring those back so that, again, women in the domestic sector have the diversity of foods and spices, etc., that they need without having to go to the market. Pastoralism. So again, now this is even more complex because pastoralism, especially nomadic pastoralism, which used to go over large landscapes, has been very badly hit by development, and also um, by downgrading their socials, not downgrading, basically looking at pastoralists as being very low status. So in fact, mostly they're Adivasis or so-called OBCs, and so there's very, very serious crisis of livelihoods. But there are a number of movements, such as with the Maldharis in Kutch or the Vangujars in Uttarakhand, to fight back and reclaim their rights to nomadism or to pastoralism, to the grazing, to the pastures, and create new products which they can then sell in the market and be able to create more secure livelihood, such as camel milk in Kutch, for instance. And then there's the whole sector of wild foods. So again, traditionally and even now, a lot of communities, including in fact even in cities, were not were dependent not only on cultivated foods but also what they could get from the wild. And these have been very important sources of nutrition or for medicinal purposes or other things. So this is an example of something we are trying out here near Pune in 6-7 villages in the Bhima Shankar Wildlife Sanctuary area, where we do festivals twice a year of wild foods. And that's become a very popular event now. There's, every year, last year when I went, in fact, there were about 50 different species or varieties of plants from the forest that had been used to make recipes, mostly old traditional recipes, but also some new ones that were being innovated by the families. And also then through that, communities trying to retain or create new ways of protecting the ecosystems from where they're getting these wild foods or from where they're getting their water or from where they're getting the genetic stock for what they're growing. So again, the community conserved areas is now the term that we use for these sorts of community-led protection of ecosystems. One of the interesting things that happened during the COVID pandemic, when things were collapsing everywhere, is we found through our network stories of communities that were much more resilient. They didn't have a food crisis, they didn't have a health crisis. So we started actually inquiring, why is that the case? There are, in these volumes, there are 70 cases around India of where communities were able to survive because they had good collective decision-making systems or could recreate them, where they had collective rights to or access to productive resources, where their food production was localized or had a local exchange with, say, the consumer rather than long distance exchange, so they could sustain that through the COVID pandemic, and many other factors. These are sort of very interesting stories to look at. We actually compiled it and sent it all off to the government, also saying, look, if you want the recovery from COVID, the recovery phase from COVID should actually be looking at these sorts of examples and supporting such resilience amongst communities. Of course, these were ignored, summarily ignored by the government. But by the way, I'll put in the chat at the end all the links to these publications. You can download all of them for free PDF. And I think when we start looking at these sorts of transformations taking place in not just food, but also livelihood systems and health and education, etc., then you start seeing the possibilities of the reversal of the normal process of migration, which is from village to city. Yeah, so that out migration, which is, of course, it's huge. We have examples now in many parts of the country where, because the villages have been so revitalized, people are coming back. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, which shows that rural-urban migration is not inevitable. The other very important thing we found when we did the COVID studies, but even before that, was that control over the local productive resources is very, very important, right? Whether that's agricultural land or it's forests or it's water or it's the coastal areas or, and of course, knowledge, etc., related to that. So then looking at movements where people are trying to reassert their democratic rights to determine what happens in their villages and their territories is very important. This is where the radical democracy part comes in. So here's an example of where 90 villages got together, where every Gram Sabha nominates somebody into this Maha Gram Sabha of 90 villages in Maharashtra to firstly, of course, have the collective force to oppose destructive mining, but also assert their cultural identity, create systems of self-reliance. Um, the women actually also saying that internally within the village there is inequality. Why are we not involved in decision making? So churning within the village itself, even as it is asserting itself in relation to the government. So this is a very interesting process, and this kind of also builds on what one village did 40 years back called Mendha Lekha in the same district in Maharashtra, fighting for forest, for taking back control over its forests. It said that we elect the government in New Delhi and Mumbai, but in our village, we are the government. And I'll come back to this when I look at the frameworks of transformation. Then the other interesting trend in some of these initiatives is also to begin to create, as an alternative to private business, to create their own community businesses, right? So farmers companies or cooperatives or producer companies of various kinds have actually begun to come up. Many of them don't necessarily work very well because they're set up by government or there's a lot of vested interest in them. But the ones that do work show the potential of how farmers can actually benefit from this and create good, healthy food. So in this case, this is part of the Timbuktu Collective in Andhra Pradesh. About 3,500 farmers have formed this company, and they brand their produce, which is all organic, in the name of Dharani. They're able to sell directly to consumers or to put in shops in Hyderabad and Bangalore, etc. And the proceeds will mostly then go back to the farmers themselves and equitably distributed amongst the farmers. And this leads to then this whole issue of how do we change the scenario without changing urban mindsets, because so much of the consumption, so much of the purchases are happening from people like us who are in cities, right? Pune or Bangalore or wherever. So again, I think, and I'm sure foodwize is also doing a lot in this. So you are not in this named in this slide because I didn't know you that well till now. But if you look at a number of other examples that I know of, or which I've been involved with, food festivals in cities, direct producer-consumer relationships, setting up farmer markets, sourcing directly from consumers. The same Dalit women farmers who I spoke about have a program called Confarm with families in Hyderabad. So the families get good, healthy food. They get to know the farmers who are growing the food. The farmers get to know the families who are consuming their food. They visit each other. So it actually builds a social relationship, not just a financial one that I come and buy food from you and then I have no idea what you are, who you are, what your troubles are, or what your happiness is, etc. And also then creating non-profit shops so that all the revenues will go back to the producer rather than be retained by some retailers. So if you look at both the previous example and this one, they also try and create alternatives to corporate retail, right? Whether it's Reliance or whoever else. Why should the profits be actually sustained by some capitalists who are actually not even growing the food? And not ensuring that whoever is consuming the food is actually getting good, healthy food, right? So why not? Why cannot there be much more direct relationships, which is what these examples are trying. Finally, and I think in terms of sort of initiatives, I think this is really important that unless we change our education system, all of this will be very, very difficult because it is in school and in our families that as children we learn, what's good in life or what our aspirations should be, what is good food and what is not good food. Whether in fact we even have the farmer in mind when we sit on the table and eat our food, the person who's toiled in 45 degrees to create the food that comes onto our plate. This all should be part of our education system. Unfortunately, it's not, especially in our formal schools, right? And of course, there's almost nothing about dirtying our hands. So it's all about stuffing things into our heads. And which is why Gandhi ji said long, long back that education, the Nai Talim thing, should be really about head, hands, and heart. So also learning values and ethics. No? And I add feet there because it's important for us to also use our feet. So these are some examples of alternative learning spaces and education spaces which are trying to change that, trying to sort of make learning fun, make learning also about doing things with the hands and the heart and the feet, learn production systems while you're learning chemistry and physics along with that, and also have an understanding of your own ecological and cultural roots, even as you learn about what's happening in the rest of the world. Eventually, the child might still go into IT or something else, but at least there'll be a sensitivity towards ecological, cultural, and those sorts of issues, including with regard to food. And then they might, or we might, become a more conscious consumer, even if we are not a producer. So, to me, I think changing education system itself is a very, very crucial part of anything we want to do with regard to food. And one of my favorite habits is to look at original meanings of words. And over the last few years, I've come across some very interesting and surprising things. So the word school comes from the Greek word schole, which means learning with leisure, which I don't know how many of you actually were in schools where there was leisure. I wasn't. Well, I was kind of lucky to have been partly like that, but 95% of India's schools are more like jails than leisure. All right. And when all these sorts of movements happen, where people are actually showing that there is an alternative, it's not just theory, but then also putting pressure on the government for policy shifts that will enable more such transformations to take place, then the government does respond sometimes. And so we bring in laws that could be relevant or programs. I think more than 16 states now support organic farming, though there's lots of problems with it, but nevertheless. And even in Sri Lanka, there was a dramatic attempt at trying to becoming organic within like almost overnight, and it collapsed because there was no preparation for it. So it's also lessons on how not to, have a right intention, but how not to go about with that intention. But so there are policy shifts which can be used for further such transformations and shifts. A quick glimpse of some of what's happening in other parts of the world. So we By the way, if anybody's feeling dizzy looking at this map because you think it's upside down, I love the map because it goes into a discussion on how our minds are colonized by maps from the colonial times where Europe was put on top and Europe was made to look much bigger than it actually is. So here you can see the sizes of the continents. Europe is much smaller than, unless you put Russia in, much smaller than Africa, and England actually totally disappears. So yeah, anyway, so sort of one of the many, many different forms of decolonization that we have to have. But basically, also, I was putting up the map to just put up a few of hundreds of examples of this kind that are happening in other parts of the world. I'll introduce that book, Blue Rivers, right at the end. Just two examples I'm going to give and then shift to the frameworks. This is indigenous people in the highlands of the Andes in Peru, where they call the Quechua indigenous people, and about five communities on a very large landscape there have claimed full collective rights to their landscape. They call it a biocultural landscape. Incidentally, this is one of the places where potato originated. And I was lucky enough to be there in 2008, and I was stunned into total silence because they showed me about 100 varieties of potato. Now, having grown up used to this one lumpy gray potato in India, I was, like, wow. So, anyway, so they have, similar to the Dalit women farmers, actually claimed food sovereignty, achieved food sovereignty through this kind of continued cultivation of crops, the use of wild crops and wild foods, and protecting their natural ecosystems. And then globally, there is, in fact, a movement which I'm sure many of you have heard of, which puts together a lot of these small farmer groups and communities, which is now hundreds of millions of farmers are actually, in one way or the other, sort of part of this. Basically, as an attempt to try and learn from each other, but also create a critical mass for shifting global policy or national policy. And we have also done put together case studies similar to the India one, but from other parts of the world. And I'll put the chat. I'll put the link in the chat later. Okay, let me then spend another 5-6 minutes. How am I doing on time?
Very well, Ashish. 4:45. But we only started 7 minutes past. So
That's okay. So
you're good.
maybe another 10 minutes to look at
Yeah,
the
please,
sort of
please. Yeah.
frameworks of transformation.
Mm.
Uh, So over the last few years, we have been using this sort of tool of trying to understand change in what we call the flower of transformation. So if we think of change as a flower with five main petals, the political, the economic, the social, the cultural, and the ecological, slightly artificial way of dividing life, but it's a way of understanding. With the core of the flower being a set of ethics and principles and values. What we are seeing is radical shifts in all of these spheres, and of course also intersecting with the foundation of an ethics of solidarity and ethics of diversity, etc. So I'm not going to go into detail in all of these, but just to give you sort of a little bit of context. So if you look at radical democracy, it is, as I said, the slogan that while we elect the government in New Delhi and Mumbai, in our village we are the government. So then democracy is not about going to elections only. In fact, that's one of the least important parts of democracy. And we see the disastrous results of that, right? Including the results that came from across the world a couple of days back. But rather, we're saying that democracy is in fact about us claiming power where we are, about things that affect our lives. Why should we leave it to bureaucrats and politicians to take decisions that are so crucial for our lives, right? So that's what some of these movements are arguing. But it also then is about how do you hold, insofar as there is still a government, how do you hold the government accountable to those basic local units of decision making, which could be a village, it could be an urban neighborhood, it could be a cluster of villages, whatever. The second component there is the economic democracy. So the Dalit women farmers arguing that for us, the most important thing is that we have full control over seeds and knowledge and land and water, right? For food. The similar thing can be added. Similar thing can be said about other forms of production, like machinery in a factory should be in the control of workers and not a capitalist who's owning that machinery, etc. Or a potter's wheel should be owned by the potter. So that, and then going beyond that and saying the economy is also, in fact, it's much less about money. It's much more about relations of exchange and caring and sharing. And even now, despite all the commercialization and financialization in our lives, we know, in at least in India, that when children have to be looked after, grandparents are around, or the enormous amount of time and effort invested by women while the husband or the brother might be going to work, and it's completely unrecognized in the formal economy, right? So these sorts of things have to be brought back center stage in reimagining the economy itself. The third part is social justice. We have huge amounts of discrimination and inequalities, whether it's to do with caste or gender or sexuality or ability, disability. There are different kinds, right? And so, again, the struggles for a more equal world, struggles for more respect and dignity are the third sphere that you see at the bottom. Then the one on the left side, culture and knowledge. So, again, taking any of the examples that I gave you, they were built on asserting, sustaining their own forms of knowledge, not accepting that the only form of knowledge uh, that is legitimate is modern science and technology, but that traditional knowledge systems are also extremely important, and that they should all be held to be equal, but also with languages. India has about 780 living languages, not dialects, full languages. And each language is a library of knowledge. So when we teach, say, Hindi all across the northern belt, we're actually erasing enormous libraries of knowledge, right? There must be 30, 40, 50 languages there. So this whole thing, but also diversity of religions, of faiths, of ways of knowing, ways of being, of, of cultures, broadly speaking. And finally, of course, the fifth sphere, top left-hand side, ecological resilience, because without sustaining the earth, we're all dead anyway, however rich we and powerful we might be. So that actually leads to a very crucial part of how do we reinsert ourselves within nature? And I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, if you take all of these things into account, the notion of Swaraj, which is possibly 1,000 years old in India, but brought back into prominence by Gandhi in the independence struggle, is a very interesting one. Because basically the notion says, I am free. We as a community are free. We as a country are free. That's the first. We are autonomous. We are self determined. We claim our own power to take decisions. But, and this is a difference between this and liberal forms of Western democracy, but we also accept that we are responsible for your freedom and your happiness and your well being. Yeah, because which means that I can't do whatever I want. I have to have some restraints. I should be able to meet my basic needs and aspirations, but without destroying your ability to meet your basic needs. So, in that sense, it's a very nuanced notion of, or a nuanced, a deeper notion of democracy. And what we have done, some colleagues and I have done, is to extend that to say eco Swaraj, which means that the responsibility is not just to other human beings, but to all of nature. So that's why radical ecological democracy. Radical, by the way, another of those words which is badly distorted. When I was in Kashmir this time, I was telling activists that please don't say that people who are killing each other are radicalized. A radical is good. It's going to one's own roots, right? I would say actually they're superficialized. It's only a superficialized religious person who actually will kill another religious person from another religion. Anyway, that's an aside. But the notion here is very simple. Democracy is about all of us being part of decision making, holding that power, but being responsible while holding the power and taking those decisions, responsible to other people and to other species. There's similar notions all over the world. Indigenous peoples, ancient notions such as Ubuntu from South Africa, which many people think is only a software. It's not. It's actually an ancient philosophy which says, I am because we are. So it locates the individual within the collective. Buen Viver and many others from Latin America and so on. But also the way religions are being reinterpreted by some people from within the religions. If you take, say, liberation theology in Latin America from within the Christian fold, or if you take socially engaged Buddhism and many others, they're trying to actually say that religion itself has become a source of inequality and hierarchy and dogmatism. We have to rescue it from that and go back to its spiritual roots. And then there are alternatives from within the capitalist industrial West, such as degrowth, increasing movement in Europe, which is saying that in order for the rest of the world to be able to properly meet its needs, the West has to downscale its material and energy consumption by a factor of 10, right? So there's many such movements, and this is why we call it a pluriverse. It's not a single solution to the world's problems. It's many solutions, but linked through a set of values and principles. The core of the flower of transformation is really about saying, okay, self-governance and autonomy, not giving up our powers to bureaucrats and politicians. It's about cooperation, not competition. It's about commons, not privatization. Right? It's about saying that physical labor out on a farm should be as dignified and valued as me sitting and giving you this presentation, right? In so-called intellectual labor. It's about happiness being about having great opportunities to be out in nature, to be with friends, to, of course, have good food to eat, etc. Not necessarily about going and buying the 50-inch color television set, which is in the ad of Reliance, which says the Republic of Happiness. And so on. I'm not going to all of these in detail. But I think basically, if you were to look at this set of values, and I'm sure all of you can add more, young people we work with added enjoyment and fun. They said everything else is fine, but it's too serious. So we put all these together. What we emerge with is what possibly could be called worldviews that celebrate life. So that one Dalit woman farmer, Vinodamma, whose farm I visited a few years back, she has 2.5 acres of land, completely organic, her own seeds, her own knowledge. She grows enough food for 10 people for the whole year with no external inputs. She's the celebrity, not the Elon Musks and the whoever else. I'm sure you can all come up with many names. So it's these worldviews that we have to talk about, we have to promote, we have to come up with in order for even something like food transformations to take place. And just the last 2-3 minutes now, if you were to put all those 5 petals and these values together, it also leads us to this very interesting and potentially dangerous conclusion that we have to challenge our political boundaries also. Potentially dangerous meaning like somebody like me can be called anti-national. But if if you take the way in which, say, South Asia has been divided, you look at South Asia through its political boundaries, and you look at South Asia through its cultural and biological and ecological boundaries, which is the second slide on the bottom, um, they emerge very differently. Why should the Ganga, which is a single river, be divided into three or four countries, where India then has the power to build a Farakka barrage, which causes huge problems to Bangladesh, or the Brahmaputra, which is another, I forget the Chinese name, the Tibetan name, which is being dammed in Tibet by the Chinese, and is going to cause huge problems to all of Northeast India, right? Or why should nomadic wild donkeys and other wildlife and nomadic pastoral populations, which used to go back and forth between Ladakh and Tibet, now not be able to go because there's a fence and armies on both sides? So can we begin to reimagine, at least to start with, reimagine South Asia from a biocultural perspective? Even with, again, something like food, how do those connections which have been there in the past get rebuilt or reimagined, right? Of course, on the ground, very difficult to implement, but there's no harm in dreaming. And then many of these things, actually, in many parts of the world, this is already happening. People are beginning to say, how do we transcend boundaries in order for ecological and cultural systems to be brought back in? Let me then end this part and then take a minute on the Vikalp Sangam process by acknowledging that all of this sounds good, but obviously we have huge challenges. All the examples I've given you are still marginal to the dominant system. We have other problems like, okay, a lot of organic farming, but when you come to a city, then there's a shop near my house where I can get great organic food, but it costs twice or thrice what I can otherwise buy in the market. Sikkim, which is now 100% organic, I think, but a lot of it is for exports, not for local consumption. You can, go and talk blue in the face till you're blue in the face about how great agriculture is, but if the new generation of farmers is not interested in farming, then what is that's a huge challenge, etc. So there's many of these sort of challenges that have to be looked at. All of them also have answers and solutions, still marginal, but which we can use to kind of fight back. So for instance, new generations not being interested in agriculture, I found now in many parts of India where young people have gone to cities, got disillusioned, come back to the villages, and they're making a combination of sustaining their agriculture, but also home-based ecotourism or running a cafe. Yeah, so you actually have a hybrid system which young people might be interested in, which doesn't abandon everything from the past, but also create something new. And then this question of how do you reach scale? And I think with food and agriculture, this is a very interesting one because we have seen that where movements for organic sustainable farming started maybe a few years back, 20 years back, 30 years back. I mean, of course, traditionally it's all been organic, but in the new forms, there were a few individual farmers or clusters of farmers. Today, it's a much larger movement. So basically, scale is being achieved for something like sustainable food through what I call outscaling. So it's not a single farmer or organization that becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, which is the upscaling model. It's really, I do what I'm doing, you do what you're doing, and let's connect. And we learn from each other and we adapt to our own situations and contexts. But then we connect horizontally to create national or global movements which will make the change. And there are now many such movements. Foodwize, I don't know whether you're part of any of these or not, but there's a lot of movements in India and globally which are actually doing this kind of connections to create greater scale. And the thing we started about 10 years back also with a similar objective is Vikalp Sangam. So this is where people from all the different sectors of life are able to come together to share, to constructively critique each other, to add expertise and experience. Like if you're working on health and I'm working on food, then let's connect. If you're working on education and I'm working on gender, let's connect because they're all interrelated, right? So that's the idea. We have met for actual physical sangams or confluences about 30 times across India on different topics, including food. So the food sangams have obviously been one of the most fun because we end up also collectively cooking. People bring stuff from various parts of the country, but also local food is celebrated. Actually, in all the Sangams, local food is celebrated. Then we also collect stories. So we have more than 2,000 stories of transformation from across India now on this website. And every 2, 3 days, some stories are being added. If you're ever depressed about life or about Trump winning or whatever, then please drop all that and go to this website. I guarantee you'll cheer up for a while. We then also do joint collective visioning. So the Vikalp Sangam has about 90 organizations and movements across the country. And we kind of say, okay, what's our collective vision of what should India look like? Yeah. So like a dream vision, and then of course pathways to get there. And in the pathways also is policy advocacy. So this year, before the elections, we produced this People's Manifesto about what changes we want in the economy, in society, in politics, etc., to enable much more sustainability and justice for the country. And then building on this and connecting to similar networks elsewhere in the world, we started this global tapestry in 2019. Very similar objectives: learning from each other, cross-cultural exchange, yeah, greater critical mass for policy shifts and things like that. So basically, that's it. Oh, sorry, this is the global. This is the so like Vikalp Sangam website, which is all in India, about India. This one is more global. So there's lots of stories of changes in other parts of the world. I'll I'll put all these in the chat so you can copy the links later. And these books. So the book on the right hand side is where there's 100 examples of radical change across the world, practical conceptual examples. And the book on the left hand side is an interesting experiment we tried a few years back of asking people who are experienced in different sectors of life, food, health, energy, gender, etc., to write about their dream vision of India in 2100, and then come back to the present and say, how do we get there? What are the opportunities? What are the hurdles? What are the challenges? What are the pathways, right? So it's kind of a utopian visioning, but with very practical pathways there. And talking about utopia, oh, I don't have that slide. Okay, I forgot that slide, but there's a slide I have of because when people say, okay, this is a great vision, but we're never going to be able to achieve it. So what's the point? What's the point of utopian visioning, right? So there is a Argentinian filmmaker, Fernando Birri. He said that utopia is 10 steps away from me and I walk 10 steps, but then it further recedes 10 steps. So I never reach it. So what's the point? He said the point is we're actually at least walking towards an ideal that we want. So I think visioning is therefore also a very, very important activity. Okay, thanks. Sorry, I've been a little bit longer than I should have, but I hope I've given
No.
some sense of not just food, but sort of interconnections between that and other aspects of life. I
Yes.
will share the PowerPoint with you all with foodwize, and please feel free to share it elsewhere. There's no copyright on this PowerPoint. And as we start the discussion, I'll also put all the links to the documents in the chat. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Ashish.